The sonar screen flickers, and then there it is, a clean geometric shape rising from the seafloor off the coast of Cuba, roughly 650 meters beneath the surface. Symmetrical, stepped, sitting in water so deep that no sunlight has touched it in living memory, possibly in human memory. The researchers on board the Project Explorer vessel in December 2001 stare at the image. The side-scan sonar has just traced what looks unmistakably like the outline of a pyramid, and then another and another, spread across roughly 2 square kilometers of Caribbean seabed. Nobody has a clean explanation for what they are looking at. That's not a dramatic flourish. It's the actual situation. The researchers, Paulina Selitsky and Paul Weinsweig, would later suggest these structures might be more than 50,000 years old. That claim has never been confirmed by radiocarbon dating, thermoluminescence analysis, or any peer-reviewed archaeological study. The Cuban Academy of Sciences hasn't endorsed a cultural origin. No excavation has followed. What the sonar captured that day remains exactly what it was when the image first appeared on that screen, a shape in the water and a question without a settled answer. And Cuba is not alone. Thousands of miles away, off the southern tip of Japan's Ryukyu Islands, a local diver first noticed something unusual in 1986. What he found, sitting at roughly 25 meters beneath the Pacific, was a massive stone formation with flat faces, sharp angles, and what appeared to be terraced steps rising toward a broad flat summit. Marine geologist Masaki Kimura would later describe it as a stepped pyramid at the heart of a 5,000-year-old submerged city. His counterpart, geologist Robert Schoch, would look at the same structure and argue the angles and faces are the product of natural sandstone fracturing. Impressive, yes, but geological rather than human. Japan's own cultural agencies have never officially recognized the site as a heritage structure. Decades of diving and debate later, the formation known as the Yonaguni Monument remains disputed at every level. Then, in 2021, an amateur sailor named Diocletian Silva was navigating between the Azorean islands of Terceira and São Miguel in the mid-Atlantic, when his sonar equipment registered something unexpected on the seafloor below. The data showed a square-based pyramid approximately 60 meters tall, with a base of around 8,000 square meters, and, notably, oriented to the cardinal points. The Portuguese Navy's Hydrographic Institute began conducting sonar and geophysical surveys to determine what it actually is. As of now, no determination has been made. The origin of the Azores formation, whether natural, man-made, or something else entirely, is officially undetermined. 3 sites, 3 continents. The Western Pacific, the Mid-Atlantic, the Caribbean. Each one presenting a shape that at least resembles deliberate construction. Each one sitting beneath water that would have been dry land at various points in the Earth's geological past, during periods of lower sea levels. And each one caught in the same unresolved state. Investigated but not explained, debated but not settled, fascinating but not proven. This is where the story gets complicated, because the gap between a shape that looks like a pyramid and a pyramid that was actually built by human hands is enormous. That gap is exactly where myth tends to rush in. The internet doesn't wait for sonar surveys to conclude or peer-reviewed papers to publish. It fills the space immediately, with Atlantis, with lost civilizations, with ancient advanced cultures that mainstream historians are supposedly hiding or ignoring. The claims get bigger as the evidence stays thin. What this video is going to do is something different. We're going to go through all 3 sites, Yonaguni, the Azores, and Cuba, and lay out what is actually documented versus what is being claimed. We'll look at how each formation was discovered, how researchers have tried to investigate it, what the geological and archaeological arguments on both sides actually say, and how official scientific bodies have responded. We'll look at why the institutions involved, the Japanese government, the Portuguese Navy, the Cuban Academy, have all stayed cautious, and what that caution tells us about how science actually works when the evidence is incomplete, We will not be telling you these are lost civilizations. We will not be telling you they are definitely natural formations either. What we will do is show you exactly where the documented facts end and where speculation begins, and let you see the line clearly for yourself. Because here's what is genuinely true and genuinely worth understanding. All three of these sites are real. The sonar data from Cuba is real. The stone structure off Yonaguni is real. You can dive on it. You can photograph it. Researchers have spent years studying it. The formation in the Azores produced real GPS coordinates and real sonar readings. The dispute isn't about whether these things exist. The dispute is about what they are. That question, what are they, turns out to be one of the harder questions in underwater research. Distinguishing between a natural rock formation and a human-built structure when both are submerged, eroded, and inaccessible is genuinely difficult science. The tools involved, the methodologies required, and the institutional commitments needed to do it properly are all significant. None of these three sites has yet received the full weight of that kind of investigation. So we have shapes in the water, we have competing interpretations, we have official silence and unofficial excitement, and we have a question that, depending on the answer, either confirms what geologists already understand about natural fracturing, or forces a serious rethinking of how old human civilization actually is. Let's find out what the evidence actually says. There's a reason your brain did something the moment that sonar image appeared on screen. Before you knew the depth, before you knew the location, before anyone had said a single word about what the shape might mean, your brain had already decided it was significant. That's not a flaw in your thinking. It's a feature of how human cognition works, and it matters enormously to this entire story. The human brain is extraordinarily good at finding patterns. It is, in fact, so good at finding patterns that it finds them whether they are there or not. Psychologists call the specific tendency to perceive meaningful shapes in ambiguous or random stimuli pareidolia, the same mechanism that makes you see a face in a cloud, or a figure in wood grain, or a human profile in a hillside. It's not imagination running away from you. It's a perceptual system doing exactly what it evolved to do, scanning the environment for recognizable structure and flagging anything that resembles something it already knows. And one of the things human brains know very well, culturally, historically, almost instinctively at this point, is the pyramid shape. Sharp edges, right angles, terraced steps rising toward a flat or pointed summit. These are the visual signatures of deliberate construction. When you see them in a building, they are deliberate construction. When you see them in stone on a seafloor, your brain runs the same program anyway. It cannot help itself. The pattern-matching system doesn't pause to ask whether the context is unusual. It sees the shape, it recognizes the shape, and it immediately produces an interpretation. Something made this. The problem, as we'll see throughout this video, is that natural geological processes can produce the exact same visual signatures. Fracture lines that create flat faces, erosion patterns that carve stepped terracing, tectonic stress that generates right-angle joints in rock. The shape alone proves nothing, but the shape alone is enough to trigger the full force of human pattern recognition, and once that happens, the narrative machinery starts moving very fast. Now add the cultural weight that the pyramid shape carries specifically. It is not just any geometric form, it is the form associated with the most celebrated ancient achievements in human history. Egypt, Mesoamerica, Mesopotamia. The pyramid is shorthand for civilization itself, for organized labor at massive scale, for religious cosmology expressed in stone, for societies advanced enough to coordinate thousands of people across years or decades to build something that would outlast them. When we see a pyramid, we don't just see a shape. We see all of that attached to the shape. We see a society behind it. We see intention and knowledge and power. So when something that looks like a pyramid appears underwater, in a place where no civilization is supposed to have been, at a depth that implies it was built thousands of years before recorded history could account for it, The brain doesn't just pattern match to geometric shape. It pattern matches to lost civilization. The leap feels natural because the cultural programming is so deep and so consistent. But it is still a leap, a significant one. And then there is Atlantis. You cannot understand why underwater pyramids generate the reaction they do without understanding the Atlantis myth. Because the myth is doing enormous amounts of work in the background of every story like this one. Plato wrote about Atlantis in 360 BCE, a powerful island civilization supposedly swallowed by the ocean in a single catastrophic event. Whether Plato intended the story as allegory, as philosophical thought experiment, or as garbled history remains genuinely debated by classical scholars. What is not debated is what the story became in the 2.5 millennia that followed. Atlantis transformed into one of the most persistent and potent myths in Western culture. The idea of a great advanced society that existed before recorded history, achieved extraordinary things, and was erased from the record by a cataclysm, leaving only fragments and mysteries behind. Every time an unusual underwater formation gets attention, the Atlantis narrative doesn't have to be introduced. It is already there, already primed, already waiting to attach itself to the new discovery. Modern media understand this. Headlines that mention Atlantis, or lost civilizations, or ancient advanced cultures reliably generate engagement in ways that headlines about geological survey methods simply don't. So the framing gets applied early and applied often, regardless of what the actual evidence shows. And once that framing is in place, it shapes how people process everything that follows. A sonar anomaly becomes evidence of Atlantis. A dispute among geologists becomes historians refusing to acknowledge the truth. Caution from official institutions becomes a cover-up. The narrative has its own momentum, and it runs well ahead of anything the science has actually established. This is not an accusation aimed at any single journalist or YouTube channel. It is a description of how information ecosystems work when a story combines genuine mystery with culturally loaded imagery and an existing mythological framework. The conditions for sensation are all present. The conditions for careful investigation are much harder to maintain in that environment. Underwater settings make this dynamic significantly worse for a very specific reason. They are epistemically hostile environments. On land, if you find a structure that might be archaeological, you can walk up to it. You can examine the surfaces directly. You can take samples, run tests, bring in multiple researchers over multiple field seasons, photograph in natural light from every angle, and gradually build up an evidence base that either supports or contradicts the initial interpretation. The process is slow, but the access is relatively manageable. Underwater, almost none of that applies. Light diminishes rapidly with depth, making direct visual inspection difficult or impossible below a certain point. Water turbidity, the particulate matter suspended in seawater, reduces visibility further. Cold, pressure, and the logistics of diving or submersible operation limit how long researchers can spend at a site and how much they can do while they're there. And so the primary tools become sonar imaging and ROV footage, both of which produce data that is, by its nature, lower resolution and more ambiguous than direct examination. Sonar works by measuring how sound waves bounce off surfaces. It produces maps of shape and contour, but those maps require interpretation. An angular protrusion in a sonar return can be a constructed wall or a natural rock face. A flat plane can be a dressed stone surface or a bedding layer in sedimentary rock. The ambiguity is not a failure of the technology. Sonar is genuinely powerful and useful, but it means that sonar data alone cannot resolve the question of whether something is natural or built. You need follow-up investigation. You need sampling. You need the kind of direct contact with the material that is extraordinarily expensive and logistically complex to achieve in deep or remote water. The Cuban formation sits at 650 meters. The Azores structure has not been fully surveyed. Yonaguni, at 25 meters, is the most accessible of the three, and even there, decades of diving have not produced the artifact evidence or datable material that would settle the argument definitively. When investigation is this difficult, hypotheses don't get tested, they accumulate. Competing interpretations sit beside each other for years, neither confirmed nor eliminated, and the space between them fills with speculation. This is the central tension that runs through everything we are about to examine. On one side, you have the visual impression, a shape that looks, often compellingly, like something that was built. That impression is immediate, powerful, and reinforced by every cultural association the pyramid shape carries. On the other side, you have the requirements of scientific proof, physical sampling, datable materials, artifacts that could only have been placed there by human activity, corroborating evidence that distinguishes deliberate construction from natural geological processes. The visual impression is easy to produce and easy to share. The scientific proof is hard-won, expensive, slow, and often absent from the conversation entirely. Understanding that gap between what something looks like and what the evidence can actually establish is the most important thing we can bring to these three sites, because the stories surrounding Yonaguni, the Azores pyramid, and the Cuban formations are not just stories about mysterious shapes underwater. They are stories about how we decide what we know and what it takes to move from a striking image to a defensible conclusion. With that framework in place, let's go to the first site, and the one where the debate has been running the longest. Before we examine any of the three sites specifically, we need to establish something foundational, a shared framework for what actually counts as evidence when you're investigating a submerged formation. Because without that framework, it's almost impossible to evaluate the claims fairly. Everything becomes a matter of opinion, and competing interpretations look equally valid when they're not. So let's be precise about the tools, the standards, and the obstacles. When researchers investigate a potentially significant underwater site, they work through a layered toolkit. The first pass is usually sonar, side-scan sonar and multi-beam sonar systems that bounce sound waves off the seafloor and return detailed contour maps of what's down there. Modern multi-beam sonar can produce remarkably high-resolution bathymetric images, mapping depth variations and surface geometry across large areas relatively quickly. That's how the Azores formation was initially documented, and it's how the Cuban site was first identified. Sonar data collected during a broader survey that wasn't even specifically looking for anomalies. Sonar is genuinely powerful technology, but it is a starting point, not a conclusion. From sonar, investigation moves toward direct visual confirmation. At accessible depths, that means scuba divers going down and examining surfaces firsthand. At greater depths, anything beyond recreational diving range, researchers deploy remotely operated vehicles or ROVs equipped with high-definition cameras, lighting systems, and sometimes manipulator arms capable of collecting samples. GPS-linked digital scanning can produce three-dimensional models of surface geometry, and geophysical tools like sub-bottom profiling and magnetometry can reveal what lies beneath the visible surface, layering, anomalies in rock density, evidence of buried features that don't appear in visual surveys. This is a serious investigative toolkit, and when applied rigorously, it can generate genuinely useful data. The critical question is what that data can and cannot tell you. Here's the problem that recurs across all three sites we're going to examine. Visual resemblance is not archaeological evidence. This distinction sounds obvious when you state it directly, but it gets lost constantly in the way these stories are told. A formation that looks like a pyramid, that has flat faces, angular edges, something resembling terraced steps, is not therefore a pyramid in the archaeological sense. It is a shape. The shape is the beginning of an investigation, not the end of one. Genuine archaeological evidence requires something more. It requires artifacts, objects that could only have been produced or placed there by human activity. It requires stratigraphic context, the ability to understand how layers of material relate to each other over time, which tells you something about sequence and history. and crucially, it requires datable material, organic substances like charcoal, shell or bone that can be radiocarbon dated, or mineral materials that can be tested with techniques like thermoluminescence or optically stimulated luminescence. Without recoverable samples and reliable dating, any age estimate for an underwater formation is indirect modelling at best and speculation at worst. This is where the underwater environment makes everything dramatically harder. On land, organic material can survive in archaeological context for thousands of years under the right conditions. Underwater, the sea is not kind to the evidence base. Currents redistribute sediment, organic matter decomposes, biological activity, marine organisms colonizing surfaces, boring into rock, encrusting formations in ways that alter their appearance, further complicates interpretation. And at significant depths, the pressure and logistics involved in actual sample collection make even a brief investigation extraordinarily expensive and operationally demanding. The Cuban formation sits at roughly 650 meters. Recovering datable material from that depth requires specialized equipment and substantial funding. None of that has been committed to the site. Without it, the claim that those structures might be more than 50,000 years old has no empirical foundation whatsoever. It's a number attached to a hypothesis, not a result derived from testing. Geologists approach this differently from archaeologists, and their methods are worth understanding specifically because they're the ones most relevant to determining whether a formation is natural or constructed. When a geologist looks at a suspected structure, they're not primarily asking whether it resembles something built by humans. They're asking whether the geometry can be explained by processes they already understand and can test. Sedimentary rock forms in layers called bedding planes. Stress and cooling produce fracture systems, networks of cracks called joints that run through rock in regular, often geometric patterns. When bedding planes are horizontal and joints are vertical, the result is a rock mass that breaks naturally into rectangular blocks with flat tops and right-angle faces. Add differential erosion, where softer material wears away faster than harder material, and you can get stepped terracing without any human intervention whatsoever. The question geologists ask is, do the fracture patterns, bedding orientations, and erosion signatures at this site match what we'd expect from natural processes acting on this type of rock? At Yonaguni, for instance, the rock is sandstone with well-defined bedding planes and documented vertical joint systems. Geologists who have studied the site, including Robert Schoch, who is himself no stranger to unconventional ideas about ancient history, have pointed to those natural fracture patterns as sufficient explanation for the stepped geometry people find so striking. That doesn't mean everyone agrees. Marine geologist Masaki Kimura has argued for years that certain features at Yonaguni show signs of human modification. But the critical point is that this is a testable disagreement, and the way you test it is through systematic geological mapping, not through visual impression. What does the rock actually show when you look at its internal structure, its mineral composition, the microscopic signatures of how it fractured? The same standard applies everywhere. Cardinal point orientation is another feature that gets cited as evidence of deliberate construction. The Azores formation is noted for appearing to align with compass points. But volcanic seamounts and geological formations can display preferred orientations too, controlled by tectonic stress fields that operate on regional scales. Orientation alone, like shape alone, is insufficient. You need to rule out the geological explanation before the cultural one gains traction, and this brings us to one of the most significant problems with the current state of all three sites. None of the cultural pyramid claims have been published in peer-reviewed archaeology journals. The peer-reviewed scientific literature that does exist on these formations is geological in nature. A 2024 Japanese study examined Yonaguni's erosional landforms, for example. But the claims that capture public attention, the assertions that these are remnants of lost civilizations built by ancient peoples, have not been subjected to the scrutiny that peer review requires. Peer review is not a perfect system, and it is not a sacred authority. but it is the mechanism by which researchers are forced to show their methods, defend their interpretations against informed criticism, and situate their findings within what is already known. When that process hasn't happened, claims sit in a permanent state of being neither confirmed nor eliminated. They circulate in media, they accumulate followers, they generate documentaries, but they don't advance toward resolution. This is not a minor bureaucratic distinction. It means that the evidentiary foundation for calling any of these formations a human-built pyramid is at present essentially absent. That doesn't mean the formations aren't interesting. It doesn't mean further investigation isn't warranted, and it certainly doesn't mean the question is closed. It means the question is genuinely open, not in the exciting sense of a mystery waiting to be revealed, but in the rigorous sense of a hypothesis that has not yet been tested to a standard that would allow a scientific conclusion. These are the standards we'll apply to each site as we go through them, not as an exercise in skepticism for its own sake, but because these are the standards that distinguish what we can actually claim to know from what we would simply like to be true. With that established, let's turn to the site that started this entire conversation, the formation off the coast of Yonaguni Island, Japan, and the decades of argument it has generated. At the southwestern tip of Japan's Ryukyu archipelago, where the East China Sea meets the Pacific and the islands thin out toward Taiwan, lies Yonaguni-jima, a small rocky island roughly 120 kilometers from the Taiwanese coast. It is remote by any measure, the westernmost point of Japanese territory, known locally for strong currents, dramatic coastal cliffs, and a species of wild horse that roams its hills. For most of the 20th century it attracted little outside attention. Then, in the mid-1980s, a local diver named Kihachiro Aratake went into the water off its southern coast and came back with something that would eventually reach every corner of the world. Aratake was exploring the waters around Yonaguni in 1986 or 1987, accounts differ slightly on the exact year, when he encountered a massive submerged formation at approximately 25 meters below the surface, roughly 82 feet down. That depth puts it well within the range of recreational scuba diving, which matters enormously for the story that followed. This was not something buried in inaccessible darkness. It could be reached, photographed, and filmed with standard diving equipment, which meant that once word spread among the diving community, the site became accessible to anyone willing to get in the water. That accessibility is a significant part of why Yonaguni became what it became. What Aratake found, and what divers began documenting in increasing numbers through the late 1980s and into the 1990s, was a structure, or formation, depending on your interpretation, of genuinely striking geometry. The main feature is a large stepped mass of rock rising from the seafloor, described by proponents as a monolithic stepped pyramid approximately 500 feet long, 130 feet wide and 90 feet tall. Even setting aside those broad dimensions, what draws the eye in photographs and dive footage is the character of the surfaces themselves. Broad flat terraces descend in what appear to be deliberate steps. Edges meet at angles that look close to 90 degrees. Large stone faces are smooth enough and regular enough that when you see them for the first time, the instinct, understandable, even if not scientifically reliable, is to ask who built this. Those are the visual features most consistently cited by people who believe Yonaguni is something more than natural geology. The rectangular silhouette when viewed in profile, the terraced descent, stair-like in its progression, the flat upper surfaces and the way the vertical drops between levels appear clean and consistent. Divers report being struck by a quality of deliberateness, the sense that these surfaces are too orderly, the angles too precise, the geometry too repetitive for purely accidental formation. At 25 meters, in clear water, the entire structure can be appreciated in a single dive, and that immediate visual experience is a powerful thing. It is worth noting, even now before we get into the geological arguments, that what people feel when they see Yonaguni up close is not trivial. The formation genuinely does not look like most underwater rock. The question the research brief demands we hold on to carefully is whether feeling is evidence. The person most responsible for bringing Yonaguni from local diving curiosity to international scientific and media conversation is marine geologist Masaki Kimura of the University of the Ryukyus. Beginning in the 1990s, Kimura conducted systematic dives and began mapping the site in detail, accumulating what he described as evidence of human construction. He catalogued features he interpreted as roads, walls, staircases, and what he called a carved human face in the rock. Kimura went public with claims that Yonaguni represented the remains of a city at least 2,000 years old, with some of his estimates reaching toward 5,000 years. Media outlets picked this up energetically. By the time National Geographic covered the site in 2007, and the BBC revisited it in subsequent years, Yonaguni had achieved a kind of permanent residency in the cultural imagination, one of those places that generates headlines on a regular cycle, each new wave of coverage reintroducing it to a fresh audience. It is important to be precise about what that media attention accomplished and what it did not. It made Yonaguni the most widely known underwater pyramid claim in the world. It brought researchers to the site who would not otherwise have gone, and it generated a genuine scientific debate. Kimura's claims drew responses from geologists including Robert Schoch, who examined the site and reached different conclusions, and that back and forth constitutes at least a partial engagement with the evidence. What the media attention did not produce is anything approaching scientific consensus. The age estimates attached to Yonaguni in popular coverage vary wildly. Some sources cite 2,000 years, others 5,000. Others leap to figures exceeding 10,000 years, based on arguments about when the formation would have been above sea level. And not one of those estimates is anchored to peer-reviewed dating of the site itself. They are calculations built on sea level models, and models are not measurements. The Japanese government's position on Yonaguni is clarifying in its bluntness. The Japanese Agency for Cultural Affairs does not recognize the formation as a cultural property. That designation matters because it effectively signals that the official archaeological and heritage apparatus of Japan has not concluded, after decades of awareness, that the site shows confirmed evidence of human construction. Investigation has been left to private researchers, to Kimura's ongoing academic work, and to the occasional academic expedition that has examined particular features. There is no nationally funded excavation program, no official site protection, no cultural heritage designation. The formation sits in the sea, dived by tourists and researchers alike, its status still formally unresolved. That ambiguity is precisely what makes Yonaguni the ideal entry point into this broader conversation. Of the three sites we're going to examine, it is the one with the most accumulated documentation. It has been physically accessible to researchers for nearly 4 decades. It has attracted genuine scientific attention from multiple disciplines. It has generated real debate, not just media speculation, between qualified researchers who have actually been in the water and examined the rock. And yet, after all of that, it remains genuinely contested, not because the evidence is being suppressed or ignored, but because the evidence itself, as currently gathered and as currently published, does not yet support a definitive conclusion. The formation is real. The geometry is striking. The interpretation of what produced that geometry is where the disagreement lives. So when you see footage of Yonaguni and feel that pull, that sense that something too ordered sits beneath the surface off a small Japanese island, that is the productive starting point for the investigation ahead. The proponents of a human-built structure have reasons for their position worth understanding carefully. The geologists who argue for natural formation have reasons of equal weight. Both sets of arguments deserve to be taken seriously on their merits, and neither should be accepted simply because the visual experience of the site is compelling. Yonaguni is where the underwater pyramid debate lives most fully, where the science and the sensation have been wrestling longest with each other. The next question is, what is the actual strongest case that something was built there, And what does the geological record say in response? Masaki Kimura has spent more than 15 years underwater at Yonaguni. That is not a trivial commitment. He is a marine geologist at the University of the Ryukyus, not a fringe enthusiast with a camera and an agenda, and the case he has built over those years of diving deserves to be engaged with on its actual terms before we consider the counterarguments. His central claim is that the Yonaguni Monument is the remains of a city complex approximately 5,000 years old, though his estimates have ranged as high as 10,000 years, depending on which indicators he is drawing from. The core of the structure he is describing is a monolithic stepped platform, roughly 150 metres long and 27 metres tall, with right-angled edges and a series of broad terraces descending in consistent 1 to 2 metre steps from the upper surface to the sea floor. To Kimura, what matters most is not any single feature, but the cumulative effect of the layout. No one terrace in isolation proves human construction. What he argues is that the regularity of their arrangement, the consistency of their proportions, and the relationship between individual features across the full extent of the site add up to something that natural sandstone fracturing is unlikely to generate on its own. The geometry argument is the spine of his case. Flat terraces are not, by themselves, unusual in sedimentary rock. Natural bedding planes and horizontal fracture systems can produce broad level surfaces under the right geological conditions. What Kimura focuses on are the edges, the places where two surfaces meet at angles that approach 90 degrees, with a precision and repeatability that he says exceeds what random fracturing should produce. He points to what appear to be stairway-like progressions, where multiple steps of consistent height rise in a regular sequence. He identifies flat platforms that seem to have been levelled deliberately. He describes what he interprets as tool marks, linear grooves and notches in the rock that he reads as evidence of deliberate shaping rather than natural splitting. Taken individually, any one of these features might be explained away. Kimura's position is that they should be read together as a coherent structural vocabulary that implies intent. He also makes a chronological argument. During the last glacial maximum, sea levels globally were significantly lower than today. By some estimates, more than 100 metres lower in places. The sea level models Kimura draws on suggest that the current depth of the Yonaguni Monument would have placed it above the waterline somewhere between roughly 8,000 and 10,000 years ago, during a period of gradual post-glacial flooding. He has also cited stalactites found in nearby submerged caves as indirect evidence of when the area was last above sea level, since stalactites can only form in air. If those sea level reconstructions are correct, a structure at Yonaguni's current depth would have been accessible to human builders during a period that predates Egyptian pyramid construction by several thousand years, which is part of why the claim carries such weight in popular imagination. Kimura is not just proposing a lost building, he is proposing a civilization capable of large-scale construction at a time when conventional historical timelines suggest nothing of the kind existed in this part of the world. It is crucial to pause here and be honest about what these arguments rest on. Kimura's age estimates are not derived from radiocarbon dating of the site itself, from thermoluminescence testing of stone surfaces, or from any datable cultural material recovered from the formation. No inscriptions have been found. No artifacts, tools, pottery, organic material have been retrieved from or immediately around the main structure after roughly 4 decades of diving. The stalactite argument is indirect, and sea level models carry their own uncertainties. What Kimura is working with is primarily visual and geometric interpretation of the rock itself, combined with circumstantial chronological inference. That is worth holding in mind as the foundation for claims as large as the ones being made, none of which stop those claims from travelling very far, very fast. When National Geographic covered Yonaguni in 2007, the story reached an enormous global audience, and the framing, Japan's ancient underwater pyramid, mystifies scholars, embedded the site firmly in the broader Atlantis-style cultural conversation about lost civilizations. Documentary productions followed. most of them structured around the dramatic contrast between compelling dive footage and expert disagreement, which is a reliable formula for sustained audience engagement, but not always a reliable framework for understanding evidence. The BBC's coverage, including a 2020 video reel titled "The Truth Behind Japan's Mysterious Atlantis," revisited the site's imagery with the same emotional register. The wide shots of terraced rock, the slow pan along right-angled edges, the implicit suggestion that something important has been hiding here beneath the Pacific for millennia. That media amplification did something specific and measurable to the Yonaguni story. It detached the claims from their evidentiary context. Viewers encountering Yonaguni through a documentary do not typically come away with a clear sense that the human construction hypothesis is contested by qualified geologists using site data. They come away with images, extraordinary geometry under turquoise water, a researcher describing staircases and platforms, a narrator invoking the word mystery. The popular version of the Yonaguni story is not Kimura's argument. It is a more sweeping narrative about a submerged civilization that rewrites human prehistory, and the gap between those two things is significant. Kimura is making an archaeological claim about a specific site. Popular media is making a mythological claim about human origins. Supporters of the artificial structure interpretation do have a genuine point when they note that the geometry of Yonaguni is visually extraordinary. When you look at photographs of the formation's terraces and right-angle edges, the instinct to see construction is strong and consistent across viewers who have no prior investment in the question. That cross-cultural visual response is not nothing. The argument that geometry this regular, this repetitive, and this extensive would be produced by chance is a meaningful challenge to the purely natural explanation, and the supporters are right that it deserves a serious geological answer rather than simple dismissal. We will get to that answer in a moment. But there is a discipline required here that popular media consistently fails to apply: the separation of visually compelling from archaeologically confirmed. The most important constraint on the entire pro-construction argument at Yonaguni is the absence of cultural material. 40 years of diving and not a single artifact. Not a tool, not a fragment of worked material, in a form that is unambiguously separate from the rock itself. Not any organic material that could be dated. That absence does not prove the site is natural. Absence of evidence is a complicated thing in underwater archaeology, where currents move material and visibility is limited, but it is a profound evidentiary gap for a claim as large as 5,000-year-old city complex. Genuine ancient construction sites, even those submerged for millennia, tend to leave something beyond the structure itself. So the case for a lost structure at Yonaguni is this. A marine geologist with deep familiarity with the site argues that its geometry, regularity, and cumulative visual order exceed what natural processes should produce, that sea level history places it above water during a period when human construction was at least theoretically possible, and that the overall layout suggests intentional design rather than random fracture. Those are not empty claims. They represent a real interpretive position held by a researcher who has done the field work. What they are not is accepted archaeological conclusion. They are an interpretation, one that remains contested, unsupported by datable cultural evidence, and unrecognized by the official agencies responsible for Japan's cultural heritage. The structure is real. The argument about what made it is genuinely unresolved. Keep that distinction in hand as we turn to what the geological record actually says in response. So we ended the last section with a challenge. What does the geological record actually say in response to Kimura's argument? That question has a real answer, and it comes not from people who haven't looked at Yonaguni, but from geologists who have looked at it carefully and arrived at a different conclusion. The most articulate and detailed version of the skeptical case belongs to Robert Schoch, a geologist at Boston University who has dived the site personally, and whose objections are grounded in specific mechanisms rather than general skepticism. This is worth emphasizing before anything else. The disagreement here is not between researchers and people who haven't bothered to engage with the evidence. It is between researchers who have looked at the same rock and interpreted it through different scientific frameworks. Schocker's starting point is the rock itself. The Yonaguni Formation is composed of fine-grained Miocene sandstones and mudstones, sedimentary rock that formed from compressed layers of sand and silt deposited millions of years ago. This type of rock has a specific and well-understood structural character. It forms in parallel horizontal beds, and those beds are intersected by vertical fracture systems called joint sets. These are not random cracks. Joint sets develop along planes of weakness that run through the rock in consistent orientations, often at angles that approach 90 degrees to the bedding planes. The result, when erosion removes the softer material between fracture surfaces, is exactly what it sounds like: straight edges, flat faces, and step-like terraces where successive beds have broken cleanly along their joint boundaries. This is not a speculative process invented to explain Yonaguni. It is a documented mechanism that produces recognizable geometric forms in sandstone formations all over the world. The important word in Schock's argument is bedded. When you understand that the rock at Yonaguni is already organized into parallel horizontal layers, the appearance of broad, flat terraces stops being surprising. The beds were always flat. Erosion is simply revealing surfaces that were structurally predetermined by the rock's original depositional geometry. The steps in this reading are not stairways, they are bedding planes. The vertical faces between those terraces follow the same logic. Where a joint set runs perpendicular to the bedding planes, erosion along that joint produces a face that is close to vertical and close to straight, not because someone carved it that way, but because the rock's internal fracture architecture dictated that geometry before any erosive force touched it. Schock notes that the region around Yonaguni is seismically active, subject to frequent earthquakes and significant tectonic stress. That stress regularly refractures the stone, refreshing the joint surfaces and keeping the edges sharp. A face that might gradually weather into a curve on a stable inland outcrop stays angular and defined at Yonaguni because the tectonic environment keeps breaking it clean along existing planes of weakness. Then there is the role of water. The Yonaguni Formation sits in a zone of strong currents and tidal eddies. Wave action at the shallower sections is significant, and even at depth, the water movement around the structure is not gentle. Schock has argued that these hydraulic forces act as precision instruments on the rock's fracture geometry. Where a small notch or depression exists along a joint, eddy currents circulate within it, scouring out softer material and deepening the feature over time. What looks like a deliberately cut channel or hole may be the product of centuries of this kind of focused erosion, water finding the path of least resistance along pre-existing weaknesses in the rock, and enlarging them into forms that read visually as deliberate. The ocean, given enough time and the right geology, is a remarkably effective sculptor of regular forms. There is also onshore evidence that supports this natural formation reading. At a site called Saninudai, on Yonaguni Island itself above the waterline, there are exposed sandstone outcroppings that show the same kind of stepped terracing and rectilinear fracture geometry visible on the submerged monument. They are not underwater. They have not been shaped by wave action or tidal currents. They are simply sandstone breaking along its natural joint sets, and they look in photographs strikingly similar to the features that Kimura interprets as evidence of human construction beneath the surface. This is perhaps the most direct piece of evidence in the skeptical argument, because it demonstrates that the local geology is fully capable of producing the geometry in question without any human input whatsoever. Now, none of this means the question is completely closed. Schock's explanation accounts for the terraces, the edges, the vertical faces and the holes, but it does not automatically explain every feature at the site to every researcher's satisfaction. A small number of geologists and archaeologists have proposed a middle position, that the formation is primarily natural but may show signs of limited human modification, with ancient people potentially using and adapting existing rock features rather than building from scratch. That view has not achieved consensus either. What the majority of geologists who have engaged closely with the site conclude is that the natural formation model is sufficient to explain what is observed, and that the burden of proof for a construction hypothesis has not been met. That burden of proof comes back inevitably to the absence of cultural material. If the Yonaguni Monument were a human construction, or even a substantially human-modified natural feature, the expectation would be that some trace of that activity would survive. Ancient stoneworking leaves marks, tool impacts, quarry scars, the physical displacement of stone blocks from a source location to a construction location. These things produce material signatures. 40 years of diving at Yonaguni have not produced a single artifact. No tools, no pottery, no organic material, no inscriptions, no construction joints of the kind that distinguish built structures from natural formations. The supposed drawings that Kimura has pointed to, linear markings on rock surfaces, Schoch interprets as natural scratches, the kind produced by rock-on-rock abrasion in a high-current environment. The absence of cultural material is not, as sometimes argued, just a product of the ocean erasing everything. Stone tools and worked stone blocks survive in underwater contexts for millennia when they are present. At Yonaguni, they are simply not there. The institutional picture reinforces the uncertainty without resolving it. The Japanese Agency for Cultural Affairs and the Okinawa Prefecture government do not list the Yonaguni Monument as a cultural property. No official archaeological research program or preservation effort has been launched by any Japanese governmental body. The site has been left to private researchers and academics working independently, without the institutional framework that would accompany a recognized heritage site. That absence of official recognition does not mean the government has declared the site natural. The question has not been definitively adjudicated in either direction. What it does mean is that Japan's cultural heritage apparatus, which has strong incentives to identify and protect significant archaeological finds, has not found the evidence compelling enough to act on. The honest summary of where the geological debate stands is this. The skeptical case for natural formation at Yonaguni is not a dismissal of the site's unusual appearance. It is an affirmative explanation built on documented rock mechanics, regional tectonic context, and the observable behavior of erosion in high-energy marine environments. The site looks extraordinary because the combination of its geology, seismic history, and oceanographic setting has produced geometric forms that genuinely resemble constructed terracing. That resemblance is real. The mechanisms that could produce it naturally are also real. And in the absence of any cultural material to tip the scale, the geological explanation currently carries more evidential weight than the construction hypothesis, even if it does not carry the story as far or make for as compelling a documentary. The debate at Yonaguni is genuinely unresolved. What is not unresolved is the standard by which it needs to be settled. Datable evidence of human activity, or cultural material that cannot be explained by the rock, breaking the way this kind of rock breaks. That evidence has not appeared. Whether it ever will is a question the ocean is keeping to itself. The debate over Yonaguni has been running for decades, fueled by competing interpretations of the same underwater rock and a stubborn absence of cultural material that could settle the argument one way or another. Whatever verdict history ultimately delivers on Yonaguni, the case demonstrates something important, that claims of underwater pyramids do not always originate with trained archaeologists armed with sophisticated equipment. Sometimes they begin much more simply, with a person, a boat, and an unexpected reading on an instrument screen. That is almost exactly how the next story starts, and it begins not in the Pacific, but in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. In November 2021, a Portuguese amateur sailor named Diocletian Silva was making his way through the waters between two of the Azorian islands, Terceira and São Miguel. The Azores are a remote Portuguese archipelago sitting roughly in the middle of the North Atlantic, about 1,400 kilometres west of Lisbon, a chain of volcanic islands so isolated that they feel like the edge of the known world even today. Silva was not on a scientific expedition. He was not equipped with research-grade sonar or a team of marine geologists. He was doing what sailors do, monitoring the seabed beneath him through onboard instruments, when his GPS-aided sonar returned a reading that didn't look like anything he expected to find in open Atlantic waters. What the sonar data appeared to show was a large square-shaped formation rising from the seafloor, a structure that Silva described as geometrically regular, in a way that immediately struck him as unusual. He recorded the data, noted the position, and reported the discovery. The dimensions that emerged from his measurements were striking. The structure was described as approximately 60 meters tall, with a base covering around 8,000 square meters, roughly equivalent in footprint to a standard American football field. That alone would make it a substantial feature. But what drew immediate and intense attention was the additional claim about its orientation. Silva reported that the corners of the structure were aligned to the cardinal directions, north, south, east, and west, with what he described as near-perfect regularity. That combination of reported characteristics, the scale, the geometric base, and especially the cardinal alignment, is what transformed a sonar reading into an international headline. Cardinal alignment is not something you expect from a random volcanic hill. It is, on the other hand, exactly the kind of deliberate architectural choice that appears in ancient monumental structures across multiple cultures. The Egyptian pyramids at Giza align to cardinal points with extraordinary precision, as do many Mesoamerican temples and several other pre-modern structures of known human origin. When people heard that a pyramid-shaped feature in the Atlantic was reportedly oriented the same way, the word that leapt into the conversation immediately and inevitably was Atlantis. The location adds another layer to why this claim captured so much attention. The Azores are not just geographically striking. They sit at one of the most tectonically extraordinary positions on the planet, directly above the triple junction where the North American, Eurasian and African tectonic plates meet. This is not a quiet corner of the ocean floor. The Azores exist because of intense and ongoing volcanic and seismic activity at this junction, and the entire archipelago is essentially a chain of volcanic structures that have been built, reshaped, submerged and re-emerged over millions of years through these tectonic forces. When you are looking at an ocean basin that has been geologically violent and continuously active for that long, the idea that previously above-water features could now be underwater is not outlandish. Sea levels have changed dramatically over geologic time. Some land that was once above the surface is now beneath it. That basic fact is real, and it lends a certain plausibility to claims about submerged features in this region that might sound more far-fetched in a geologically stable environment. The Portuguese Navy's Hydrographic Institute did not dismiss the report. The Institute, the body responsible for maritime cartography and underwater surveying in Portuguese waters, announced that it would conduct multi-beam sonar surveys and geophysical analysis of the area to determine what Silva's instruments had actually picked up. The fact that an official government scientific body took the claim seriously enough to investigate is worth noting, though it requires some care in interpretation. Taking a claim seriously enough to investigate is very different from endorsing it. Scientific institutions investigate anomalous readings because that is the responsible thing to do, not because the anomaly has already been established as significant. The investigation itself was the appropriate first step, not a confirmation of what the discovery might be. And the Navy's initial public statements were notably cautious. Officials pointed out explicitly what the Azorean tectonic setting means for this kind of discovery. A region defined by volcanic activity is a region where unusual, large, geometrically irregular landforms on the seafloor are genuinely expected. Volcanic seamounts and submarine hills can take on shapes that, when rendered through low-resolution sonar, may suggest regularity that more precise imaging would not confirm. A volcanic hill in this region is not an exotic explanation, it is the baseline expectation. Navy officials noted directly that the reported pyramid could simply be a volcanic formation shaped by the same processes that built every island in the Azores. The ocean floor in this part of the Atlantic is not an undisturbed flat plain. It is a geologically complex and active environment where dramatic, large-scale natural formations are the norm rather than the exception. This is the point at which the distinction between what has been reported and what has been independently confirmed becomes essential to keep in mind. Everything about the Azores pyramid claim that sounds extraordinary, the 60-metre height, the 8,000 square metre base, the cardinal alignment, the perfectly square shape, comes from a single source: Diocletian Silver's onboard sonar equipment and GPS data. Silver is not a marine geologist or a trained sonar analyst. The equipment he was using was not research-grade multi-beam sonar of the kind that produces the high-resolution, three-dimensional seafloor maps that geophysicists work from. It was navigational equipment designed to tell a sailor how deep the water is, not to characterize the precise geometry of a submerged feature. Low-resolution sonar in the hands of a non-specialist, reading a large feature on the seafloor, can produce impressions of regularity that more detailed analysis does not support, and can also miss complexity and irregularity that higher resolution data would reveal. As of the time this script was researched, no independent peer-reviewed study had confirmed the dimensions, shape, or origin of the feature Silver reported. No archaeological excavation has taken place at the site. No scientific team has published a formal analysis that either verifies the cardinal alignment or establishes whether the structure is of natural or human origin. The Navy surveys were underway, but results capable of resolving the question had not entered the scientific literature. The Azores pyramid, in other words, remains exactly what it has been from the moment Silver filed his report. A claim, based on preliminary data from a single observer, that something unusual may exist on the floor of the Atlantic between two volcanic islands. That claim may eventually turn out to be significant. It may turn out to be a volcanic seamount that a sonar reading rendered as a square. Or it may fall somewhere in the complicated middle ground that Yonaguni has occupied for decades. Genuinely unusual, genuinely debated, and genuinely unresolved. What it is not at this stage is a confirmed pyramid. The instruments have pointed at something. The scientists are still looking. So where does that leave us right now? The Azores case is not a historical debate in the way Yonaguni has become. It is not a dispute that has been running for decades between established researchers with competing interpretations of the same dives and the same rock samples. It is something more unusual and in some ways more interesting. It is a scientific investigation that is actively unfolding, in real time, without a conclusion yet in sight. And understanding exactly what that investigation involves, what it can answer, what it cannot, and what it means that it is happening at all, tells us something important about how underwater mystery claims actually move through the process of becoming either knowledge or legend. The Portuguese Navy's Hydrographic Institute is the body at the centre of this process. The Institute is not a fringe organisation chasing anomalies. It is the official national body responsible for maritime cartography, oceanographic surveying, and the management of hydrographic data in Portuguese waters. Its primary mission includes something called the Mapping of the Portuguese Sea Programme, a large-scale, systematic effort to build detailed, high-resolution charts of the sea floor across Portugal's extensive maritime territory, and the Azores sit within that territory. The Institute deploys vessels equipped with multi-beam sonar systems, the kind of technology that produces genuinely precise, three-dimensional representations of the seafloor rather than the flat depth readings that navigational instruments generate. The NRPD Carlos I is among the research vessels that have operated in this region, gathering the kind of bathymetric data that allows geophysicists to actually characterize the shape, slope, and surface texture of underwater formations. When Diocletian Silver's report came in, the Hydrographic Institute's involvement represented a transition from amateur observation to institutional science. That transition matters because it changes what kind of data is being collected and what level of analysis is being applied to it. Multibeam sonar does not just tell you something is down there. It tells you in considerable detail what the contours of that thing look like, how its slopes angle, whether its edges are sharp or gradual, whether its surface shows the kind of texture associated with volcanic rock, sediment deposition, or something else entirely. That data then gets processed and interpreted by geophysicists, marine geologists, and hydrographers who know what natural formations in this part of the Atlantic are supposed to look like. But here is the critical distinction that cannot be overstated. The Institute's involvement is not an endorsement. It is an investigation. Those are fundamentally different things, and the difference gets blurred constantly in media coverage of discoveries like this one. When a headline reads that the Portuguese Navy is studying a mysterious pyramid, the word studying carries enormous implied weight. It suggests that the Navy already accepts there is a pyramid there worth studying. That is not what is happening. What is happening is that an official body is doing exactly what responsible science requires when an anomalous reading is reported, gathering better data to determine what the anomalous reading actually represents. The investigation could conclude that Silver's instruments picked up a genuine structural oddity that warrants further attention. It could conclude that the feature is a volcanic seamount whose geometry, when rendered through low-resolution navigational sonar, produced an impression of regularity that higher-resolution data does not support. Either outcome is legitimate science. Neither outcome was prejudged when the investigation began. This is also where the particular challenges of sonar interpretation become relevant. Sonar works by sending out acoustic pulses and measuring how they return from surfaces below the water. The resolution of the resulting image depends heavily on the frequency of the sonar, the distance from the target, the angle of the transducers, and the software used to process the returned signals. Low-resolution sonar of the kind typically found on recreational and semi-professional sailing vessels can suggest geometric symmetry, a flat top, straight sides, square corners, in features that higher-resolution imaging reveals to be far more irregular. This is not a failure of the sonar exactly. It is a limitation of what any instrument can resolve at a given level of precision. The ocean floor in the Azores region is covered with volcanic structures that have been built, eroded, fractured, and reshaped over millions of years of tectonic activity. Some of those structures sampled coarsely from above could return sonar signatures that look, to an untrained eye, strikingly regular. Ground truthing is the term researchers use for the process of actually confirming what remote sensing data suggests. It means sending divers, or remotely operated vehicles, or submersibles to the location and physically observing the feature in question. It means taking samples if possible, examining the material composition, looking at the texture and structure of the rock, checking whether the edges that look sharp on a sonar image are actually sharp when you can see them directly. Ground truthing is what separates a hypothesis generated by instrument data from a confirmed observation of what is actually there. The Azores pyramid has not yet been ground-truthed in any comprehensive, scientifically documented way. That is not an accusation or a dismissal of the claim. It is simply where the process currently stands. The acoustic data is being gathered and refined. The physical verification has not followed yet in any form that has produced published scientific findings. This is precisely what differentiates the Azores case from Yonaguni, and the difference is significant. At Yonaguni, the debate has a long history. Divers have been there. Researchers have argued about what they saw underwater. Marine geologist Masaki Kimura spent years mapping and documenting the site. Robert Schoch and other geologists went and examined the formations and came to different conclusions. The Japanese government made a decision, or rather a deliberate non-decision, about whether to recognize the site as cultural heritage. There is a body of direct observation underlying the Yonaguni debate, even if that observation has not resolved the argument. The Azores pyramid debate, by contrast, is still largely a debate about instrument readings and acoustic data. It has not yet reached the stage where the competing interpretations are about what researchers actually saw when they looked at the feature up close, Academic and institutional partners, including researchers at the University of the Azores and marine science institutions with interest in the region, have shown interest in the formation, which suggests the investigation is not limited to the Navy alone. But no peer-reviewed study of the feature has appeared in the scientific literature as of when this script was researched. The dimensions that circulate in every article about this pyramid, 60 metres tall, 8,000 square metres at the base, aligned to cardinal points, have not been verified by independent analysis. They remain the measurements reported by the original observer, and they carry all the uncertainty that comes with that status. What the Azores case gives us, then, is something Yonaguni never quite offered: the opportunity to watch the scientific process work in something close to real time. The claim has been made, the investigation is underway, the outcome is genuinely unknown. That uncertainty is uncomfortable if you want a definitive answer. But it is exactly what honest science looks like before it has finished asking its questions. The Portuguese Navy has instruments pointed at the seafloor between Terceira and São Miguel, and somewhere in the data those instruments are collecting, there is either an extraordinary discovery waiting to be confirmed or a natural formation waiting to be properly described. The difference between those two outcomes is enormous, and for now nobody knows which one it is. The Azores investigation is unfolding in relatively shallow institutional waters. A Portuguese Navy survey, an open research question, a body of sonar data being carefully refined. What comes next takes us somewhere far more extreme, both geographically and in terms of what the claims actually require us to believe. Off the western tip of Cuba, there is a discovery that makes the Azores pyramid look, by comparison, almost conservative. In December 2001, a Canadian exploration company called Advanced Digital Communications was working under contract in Cuban territorial waters. The project, known as Project Exploramar, was conducting a broader survey of the seabed off the Guanahaca-Bibes Peninsula, the long narrow finger of land that forms the westernmost edge of Cuba. The company was using side-scan sonar and a remotely operated vehicle to map the seafloor, and at some point during that survey, the instruments returned something unexpected. The sonar images showed a field of what appeared to be geometric stone structures spread across an area of roughly 2 square kilometres of seafloor. The shapes were described as pyramid-like forms and large circular blocks arranged in patterns that, to the eyes of the researchers examining the data, looked almost urban, not like random geology, but like something laid out with intention. The two people at the centre of the discovery were Polina Zalitsky, a marine engineer, and her husband Paul Weinsweig. They were the founders of Advanced Digital Communications, and they were the ones who examined the sonar data and decided that what they were looking at warranted serious attention. What they reported was striking enough on its own terms, but it was a single number that separated the Cuban claim from nearly every comparable discovery that had come before it. The structures were sitting at approximately 650 metres below the surface. That is roughly 2,000 feet down. To put that in context, Yonaguni is accessible to recreational divers at around 25 metres. The Azores pyramid, whatever it turns out to be, is shallow enough that an ROV survey could plausibly be organised at manageable cost. But 650 metres is deep water territory. That depth requires specialised submersibles, or sophisticated remotely operated vehicles to reach directly. It is not somewhere you can send a dive team. It is not somewhere you can easily collect rock samples or do the kind of close-up physical examination that distinguishes a detailed observation from an inference drawn from acoustic data. The extreme depth is not a side note to the Cuban claim. It is one of the central facts that has shaped everything about how the discovery has been interpreted, contested, and ultimately left unresolved. Zalitsky and Weinsweig went further than simply reporting unusual sonar readings. They suggested that the structures could have a cultural origin, that the geometric regularity they were seeing was not the product of natural geological processes, but of human construction. And in terms of age, the figures that entered circulation were staggering. Some early reports quoted estimates suggesting the site could be more than 6,000 years old. Later speculation pushed that number considerably further, with some accounts attaching an age of more than 50,000 years to the formation. That figure, if taken seriously, would place the construction of these structures at a time when anatomically modern humans had barely reached the Americas by any conventional archaeological timeline. It would predate every known civilization on Earth by tens of thousands of years. It would not merely challenge the historical record, it would require that we throw most of it out entirely. It is worth being direct about what those age estimates are actually based on. The interpretation of sonar images. No physical samples have been retrieved from the site. No radiometric dating has been conducted. No material analysis of any kind has been published in a peer-reviewed scientific journal. The age figures are not measurements. They are inferences, speculative inferences drawn by the discoverers from the visual impression of what the sonar data showed, combined with reasoning about what depth and geology might imply about when land at that location was last above sea level. That reasoning may or may not be sound, but it has not been tested by independent scientific scrutiny in any form that the broader research community has been able to examine. The scientific community's response has been, at best, cautious. No major archaeological institution has endorsed the interpretation that the Cuban formations represent human-made structures. The Cuban Academy of Sciences has not confirmed a cultural origin for the site. No follow-up expedition has produced peer-reviewed analysis that settles the question either way. The combination of extraordinary depth, the technical difficulty of follow-up investigation, and the absence of published data has left the discovery in a peculiar limbo. Too interesting to dismiss entirely, too poorly documented to build any serious scientific case upon. What the Cuban discovery did produce in abundance, however, was something else entirely. Media coverage of spectacular intensity, and speculation that moved far beyond what the evidence could support, almost from the moment the story broke. The word Atlantis appeared in headlines almost immediately. The framing was not cautious or qualified. Reports described a lost city found beneath Cuban waters. The geometric forms on the sonar images were described as pyramids, as temples, as the remnants of a drowned civilization. The sheer depth of the site, so far down that direct verification was practically impossible, paradoxically seemed to fuel rather than restrain the imagination. Distance and inaccessibility have a way of doing that. What cannot be easily checked cannot be easily disproved, and the Cuba story occupied that space between genuine discovery and unverifiable claim in a way that made it almost perfectly suited to Atlantis-style mythologizing. The Atlantis connection, once made, proved extremely difficult to separate from the actual discovery, and this matters because the Atlantis narrative does not function as a scientific hypothesis. It functions as a cultural filter through which ambiguous evidence gets reinterpreted to support a conclusion that was already there before the evidence arrived. When every unusual sonar reading in deep water becomes potential confirmation of a drowned civilization, the evidentiary standards that normally govern archaeological claims dissolve entirely. The Cuban formations got caught in that filter very quickly, and once they were inside it, the more sober task of actually determining what the sonar data showed was largely displaced by the much more exciting story of what it might mean. That displacement has consequences. It means that the questions most worth asking, what exactly do the images show? Are these formations consistent with known geological processes in this region? What would a proper follow-up investigation require? What funding and institutional support would be needed to reach that depth and collect verifiable data? Those questions received far less attention than the larger, grander narrative that the media found more compelling. The story became about Atlantis. The science, such as it was, got left behind. What we are left with, more than 2 decades after that sonar survey in Cuban waters, is a genuine mystery in the most limited and honest sense of that word. Something was detected at 650 meters depth off the Guanahaca-Bibes Peninsula, and we do not know with any certainty what it is. It may be a natural geological formation whose apparent regularity is a product of how sonar resolves complex seafloor topography at depth. It may be something that warrants sustained, serious investigation. But the claim that it is an ancient city, built by humans tens of thousands of years ago, rests on nothing more substantial than an impression formed from acoustic data collected during a single expedition and never independently verified. That is not an explanation. It is a suggestion. And in the company of the other sites we've been examining, it raises a question that becomes more pressing the more cases we put side by side. So let us be precise about where that leaves us, because precision is exactly what the Cuba story has lacked from the beginning. A sonar anomaly is a reading. It is acoustic data, pulses of sound sent toward the seafloor and interpreted by software and by human analysts examining the returns. Sonar is a genuinely powerful tool. It has transformed our ability to map the ocean floor at scale, and it has led to real discoveries, shipwrecks, geological features, previously unknown undersea terrain that no human eye had ever seen. But sonar has limits that are easy to forget when the images it produces look striking. What sonar gives you is a representation of shape. It tells you something about the geometry of a surface, about the relative heights and angles of features rising from the seafloor. What it cannot tell you, on its own, is what those features are made of, how they were formed, or whether any human hand had anything to do with their existence. The Cuban sonar images show forms that the discoverers interpreted as geometric and regular. Pyramidal shapes, rectangular blocks, circular arrangements that struck Paulina Zalitsky and Paul Wainsweig as too organized to be natural. That impression is understandable. The patterns in the data are unusual enough that they attracted serious attention from a marine geologist, Manuel Iturralde, who estimated that the land at that depth would have been above sea level roughly 50,000 years ago. But here is where the chain of reasoning becomes critically important to follow carefully. Iturralde's estimate is a geological calculation about when submergence might have occurred. It is not a confirmation that structures exist, and it is emphatically not evidence that humans built anything at that location. It is a statement about water and land and time. The leap from that calculation to a human-constructed city of 50,000 years ago involves several enormous inferential steps, none of which have been tested by any published peer-reviewed analysis. That age figure deserves particular scrutiny because of what it would actually require us to accept. 50,000 years ago, anatomically modern humans were present in parts of Africa, Europe, and Asia. The first credible evidence of humans in the Americas dates to somewhere between 15 and 20,000 years ago by conventional archaeology, with some contested sites pushing that boundary modestly earlier, but not by tens of thousands of years, and certainly not to a point where complex urban construction in the Caribbean becomes plausible. A civilization capable of building pyramid-like structures on that kind of scale, 50 millennia ago, in a region of the world that current evidence suggests was not yet inhabited by humans at all, would require us to discard not one or two inconvenient data points from the archaeological record, but the entire framework of what we understand about prehistoric human migration and development. That is not impossible in principle. Science revises itself. But the bar for a revision that dramatic is extraordinarily high, and the Cuba claim clears none of that bar. What would actually be needed to take this seriously as an archaeological claim? At minimum, direct visual confirmation of the structures by ROV at resolution, sufficient to distinguish angular, worked stone from naturally fractured geology, physical samples, actual pieces of material retrieved from the site, that could be analysed compositionally and, if organic material is present in the right context, dated by radiometric methods. Documentation detailed enough to rule out geological explanations. The region around Cuba is tectonically active and angular. Apparently regular formations can and do result from natural fracturing and deposition processes in such environments. Independent investigation by researchers with no prior investment in the conclusion Working from raw data rather than from the original team's interpretations, none of that has happened. The follow-up ROV sortie, conducted in 2002, produced higher-resolution sonar images and some video footage that showed what were described as smooth granite-like blocks. But no samples were collected, no dating was conducted, and the findings were not written up in any peer-reviewed scientific publication. That is not a minor procedural gap. In archaeology and geology, peer review is how claims become knowledge. It is how raw observation gets stress-tested against alternative explanations, how methodology gets examined by people who are not trying to confirm a particular result. Without it, a claim remains a claim, and in the case of Cuba, that is precisely where things have stayed for more than 2 decades. The extreme depth is not merely an inconvenience, it is a fundamental barrier that shapes what can and cannot be known about this site without a serious, properly funded, institutionally supported investigation. At 650 meters, conventional scuba diving is not an option. ROV operations at that depth require specialized equipment, substantial financial resources, and logistical infrastructure that does not simply materialize because a story is interesting. The fact that the follow-up in 2002 produced video but no samples illustrates exactly how difficult it is to do rigorous science at that depth. You can see something. You cannot easily pick it up, core it, or date it. And seeing something that looks unusual through a camera is very different from demonstrating what that thing is and how it came to exist. The absence of follow-up expeditions is telling in another way as well. If the sonar data were genuinely compelling to the broader scientific community, if researchers who examined it independently found that it presented a credible case for human-made structures, the argument for sustained investigation would be much harder to ignore. Extraordinary discoveries do attract funding and attention, even when they are controversial. The Cuban formations have not attracted that kind of sustained institutional interest. The Cuban Academy of Sciences has not confirmed a cultural origin. No major archaeological body has endorsed the site as worthy of prioritized investigation. That collective absence of institutional engagement does not prove that nothing is there, but it is a meaningful signal about where the evidence actually stands among people whose professional obligation is to evaluate it rigorously. What the Cuba claim can prove at present is limited but real. It can demonstrate that a sonar survey detected unusual features on the seafloor off the Guanahacoibes Peninsula. It can establish that those features were interesting enough to prompt a follow-up ROV mission. It can document that the geometry of the sonar return struck at least some observers as potentially consistent with artificial construction. That is a tantalizing lead. In the vocabulary of scientific investigation, it is the beginning of a question, not the end of one. What it cannot prove, what no sonar image alone can ever prove, is that what lies at the bottom of the sea off Cuba is the remnant of a human civilization. It cannot establish an age of 50,000 years through the logic of submergence timing alone. It cannot demonstrate architecture or intentional design without physical evidence examined by independent researchers, and it cannot substitute impression and speculation for the kind of documented, testable, reproducible evidence that archaeological claims require before they can be taken seriously. The Cuba site is the most speculative of the 3 cases we have been examining, and the evidentiary distance between what was found and what has been claimed about it is the widest of the 3 by a considerable margin. That does not make it uninteresting. It makes it exactly the kind of discovery that should motivate careful, methodical investigation, the kind that has not yet materialized. Until it does, the Cuban underwater formations remain what the data has always shown them to be: a genuinely unresolved puzzle at the bottom of a very deep sea, surrounded by claims that have far outrun the evidence available to support them. With that picture of the Cuba claim clearly in view, it becomes possible to step back and look at all 3 of these cases together, not as separate mysteries unfolding in isolation, but as a set of disputed claims that can be compared directly and honestly against each other. 3 continents, 3 bodies of water, Three very different sets of circumstances leading to three very different kinds of evidence. And in all three cases, the same fundamental gap between what was found and what has been concluded about it. Start with geography and depth, because the physical settings alone tell you a great deal about what kind of evidence is even theoretically available at each site. Yonaguni sits off the southern tip of Japan in the Philippine Sea, a shallow reef environment where the monument rises from about 25 meters of water. That is sport diving depth. Since Kihachiro Arataki first encountered it in 1986, researchers, underwater photographers, and recreational divers have been able to descend on it with their own eyes, examine its surfaces directly, trace the lines of its terraced steps with their hands. Whatever debates exist about Yonaguni, and they are substantial, they are not debates driven by a lack of direct visual access. The place has been looked at repeatedly by many pairs of human eyes. The Azores pyramid occupies a different register entirely. Discovered in 2021 by amateur sailor Diocletian Silva, using a boat-mounted sonar scanner in the mid-Atlantic volcanic zone between Terceira and São Miguel, the top of the structure reportedly sits at roughly 40 meters depth, with a total claimed height of around 60 meters and a base of approximately 8,000 square meters. The Portuguese Navy's Hydrographic Institute has conducted subsequent sonar surveys of the area, but the origin of the formation, natural, human-made, or something in between, has not been determined. Crucially, no diver-scale visual verification of the structure has been published. What exists is acoustic data. Sonar returns interpreted as showing a pyramid-like shape with apparently regular geometry and an orientation aligned to the cardinal points. The claim is sonar-led, and sonar is all it rests on at this stage. Cuba is deeper still, dramatically so. At approximately 650 meters below the surface off the Guanahacabibes Peninsula, the formations detected by the Project Exploramar research vessel in 2001 exist in a world that no human being has directly observed. The side-scan sonar data from that survey produced images of geometric shapes spread across roughly 2 square kilometers of seafloor, shapes that the expedition team interpreted as pyramidal forms, rectangular blocks, and organized arrangements. An ROV follow-up in 2002 captured video footage but retrieved no physical samples and produced no peer-reviewed analysis. At 650 meters, the gap between sonar representation and confirmed reality is at its widest. Acoustic imaging at that depth, with the resolution available in 2001, renders features in ways that can exaggerate apparent regularity. Shadows and return angles interact in complex ways. What looks organized in a sonar image may be organized, or it may be an artifact of how the signal was processed and interpreted. So you have 3 discovery methods that represent 3 very different rungs on the ladder of evidentiary confidence. Yonaguni was found by direct visual observation and has been extensively photographed and surveyed in person. The Azores pyramid was located by sonar and has been followed up with additional sonar. The Cuban formations were identified by sonar and have received only limited ROV video with no physical analysis. As you move from Japan to the Atlantic to the Caribbean, the directness of the evidence decreases substantially. The reported geometry and scale of each site differ as well, in ways that matter for how the claims are evaluated. Yonaguni's formations are comparatively modest in scale, terraced steps and flat platforms rising perhaps 20 meters, with geometry that generates genuine disagreement about whether it is architectural or the product of natural sandstone fracturing. The Azores structure is described as a nearly perfect square pyramid, substantially larger, with orientation to the cardinal points that its proponents find too precise to be geological coincidence. The Cuban formations, if the sonar interpretations hold, span an area large enough to encompass an entire civic complex. Each successive claim is larger and more dramatic than the last, and each successive claim rests on thinner direct evidence. The certainty levels across the 3 sites follow the same gradient. Yonaguni has the most evidence, and, paradoxically, perhaps the most rigorous ongoing debate, because having actual rocks to look at means having actual rocks to argue about. Geologists like Robert Schoch have examined the site and argued that the formations are consistent with what natural sandstone fracturing produces in that type of marine environment. Right-angle joints, flat surfaces, step-like erosion patterns. Marine geologist Masaki Kimura has argued the opposite with equal directness, suggesting the structures show signs of tool marks and intentional shaping. Neither side has been able to produce definitive physical dating. The Japanese government has not recognized the site as cultural heritage. Two trained researchers working from the same visual evidence reach opposite conclusions. That tells you something important about how resistant the underlying question is to easy resolution even when you can see what you are arguing about. At the Azores, the Portuguese Navy is still in the process of conducting geophysical surveys. A sonar-detected shape, however regular it appears in the acoustic data, has not been ground-truthed. The cardinal point orientation that proponents emphasize is compelling as a description, but orientations that appear precise can emerge from geological processes in volcanically active zones, where fracture patterns and lava flow directions interact in ways that produce apparent regularity. The Azores sits on the mid-Atlantic ridge, a geologically dynamic environment. Until the seafloor at that location is directly examined and sampled, the most honest statement available is that a sonar anomaly of unusual geometry was detected, and its origin is unknown. And then there is Cuba, where no confirmed physical evidence of any kind has been retrieved, no peer-reviewed analysis has been published, and the most dramatic age estimate floated, 50,000 years, relies on a geological submergence calculation, rather than any direct dating of material at the site. What emerges when you lay all three cases against each other is a pattern that is difficult to ignore. In each instance, something visually or acoustically striking was found in a marine environment. In each instance, that striking appearance generated claims that exceeded what the evidence could actually support. And in each instance, the consensus among independent scientific and governmental bodies has been either skepticism or cautious suspension of judgment, not endorsement. The three settings create three different kinds of ambiguity. Shallow, diver-accessible sites produce debates about geological interpretation. Mid-depth sonar sites produce debates about what acoustic data can legitimately be read to mean. Deep-sea sonar sites produce debates that cannot even properly begin until someone commits to the kind of investigation that has not yet taken place. Each type of ambiguity is real, but they are not equally tractable, and they do not justify equal levels of confidence in the claims built on top of them. Three sites, three continents, three striking shapes that found their way into headlines and captured imaginations around the world. And in all three cases the same honest conclusion: remarkable observations that deserve serious investigation, surrounded by claims that have consistently run well ahead of the evidence available to support them. So you have three sites, all disputed, all under-investigated, all generating significant public attention. And in every case, the agencies and institutions with the formal authority to recognize, protect, or fund further research have declined to endorse the most dramatic interpretations on offer. That restraint looks, to some observers, like deliberate obstruction. To others, it looks like cowardice or indifference. But when you look at the actual mechanics of how scientific and governmental bodies operate in these situations, what that restraint mostly looks like is something more mundane and more legitimate: institutional caution rooted in hard-won professional standards. Start with what it actually takes for an underwater site to receive official heritage recognition or archaeological endorsement. The bar is not set arbitrarily high. It is set at the level required to ensure that what gets recognized as culturally significant actually is culturally significant, and not a natural formation that a sonar image made look architectural. That means datable material evidence, ideally radiocarbon dates, thermoluminescence results, or equivalent techniques applied to physical samples retrieved from the site. It means inscriptions, tool marks, or construction materials that cannot be explained by geological processes. It means peer-reviewed publication in which independent specialists have evaluated the methodology and found it sound. None of the three sites, Yonaguni, the Azores Pyramid, or the Cuban formations, has cleared those basic bars. Not one of them has produced published, independently verified, peer-reviewed dating. Not one has yielded physical artifacts confirmed as human-made. The absence of official endorsement in that light is not a mystery requiring explanation. It is exactly what the evidence predicts. Japan's Agency for Cultural Affairs has stated plainly that it does not regard the Yonaguni formations as cultural property. That is not a dismissal of the question. It is a formal acknowledgement that the question has not been answered to the standard required for recognition. The site sits in the waters off Okinawa Prefecture, but the jurisdictional picture is complicated enough that neither the prefectural government nor the National Cultural Agency has clear authority to formally designate or protect it, which has effectively created a legal vacuum. Private researchers, most prominently Masaki Kimura, have continued to work there because the institutional machinery for systematic public funding simply has not engaged. That vacuum is not evidence that officials are hiding something. It reflects the genuine difficulty of managing heritage claims in offshore environments where legal frameworks were not designed with ambiguous geological/archaeological sites in mind. Portugal's response follows a similar logic, though expressed through a different institutional structure. The Portuguese Navy's Hydrographic Institute is conducting sonar and geophysical surveys of the area, where Diocletian Silva detected the Azores formation in 2021. But the Institute is careful to frame that work within its primary mandate: strategic sea mapping for navigation, environmental assessment, and national maritime security. That framing is not evasive. It reflects the reality that the Portuguese Navy is not an archaeological body, and that the budget and expertise required for genuine underwater archaeological investigation would need to come from different channels: university research groups, heritage ministries, and probably international partnerships, all of which require time and coordination that a sonar anomaly without confirmed cultural significance does not yet command. When a headline reads "Sunken Atlantis Pyramid Discovered," institutions that issue premature confirmatory statements pay credibility costs they cannot easily recover. The Hydrographic Institute's cautious, non-committal public posture is, in part, a learned response to precisely that risk. Cuba presents the sharpest case of the gap between what was found and what official science has been willing to say about it. When the 2001 Project Explorer data became public, researchers from the Cuban Academy of Sciences commented on the sonar findings, but they were careful to emphasize that formal archaeological evaluation was still pending and that conclusions required input from serious authorities on ancient civilizations before any official position could be taken. That measured language frustrated people who wanted the Cuban government to either confirm or deny the presence of a lost city on their continental shelf. But the Cuban Academy's caution was epistemically honest. The ROV that followed up in 2002 experienced technical problems that limited the scope of the survey, and no physical samples were retrieved from a depth of 650 meters. Commenting substantively on an unexplained sonar image from the deep Caribbean, without physical evidence and without peer review, would have been a scientific overreach regardless of national interest or public pressure. The funding and access constraints that shape all of this deserve direct acknowledgement because they are not abstract. They are the practical reason why these sites remain in limbo. Deepwater investigation is extraordinarily expensive. Multi-beam sonar surveys, remotely operated vehicles capable of operating at 650 meters, specialized research vessels with the onboard processing capacity to make sense of what the instruments collect. These resources require institutional commitment at a scale that is not justified by photographs of sonar anomalies circulating on the internet. The Cuban expedition in 2001 halted, partly because of the technical limits of the ROV being used at that depth. The Portuguese Navy's sea mapping programme prioritises areas according to navigational and strategic importance, not public curiosity about pyramid-shaped features. These are budget-driven, mission-constrained decisions, and they are not going to change because a documentary generated 2 million views. Media attention creates its own particular set of pressures on institutional behaviour, and not in the ways that conspiracy-minded narratives usually suggest. The mainstream assumption in popular coverage is that media attention should unlock institutional resources and accelerate investigation, that if something is important enough to go viral, it should be important enough for governments to act on. In practice, the relationship runs almost in the opposite direction. When a story reaches the level of sunken Atlantis pyramid, the agencies closest to it become more cautious, not less, because the reputational stakes of a misstep have multiplied. Japan's cultural agency spokesperson, responding to the surge of international interest in Yonaguni following National Geographic's 2007 coverage, chose language that emphasised the absence of official research rather than speculating on what the formations might be. That was a deliberate institutional choice to stay behind the evidence rather than ride the wave of public excitement. An agency that gets photographed endorsing a lost civilization and then has to walk it back has lost something it does not easily recover. The incentive structure, in other words, pushes responsible institutions toward caution precisely when public pressure is loudest. There is also a political dimension to each of these cases that shapes how governments handle the ambiguity. For Portugal, framing the Azores' work as strategic sea mapping, rather than archaeological exploration, keeps the research within a context where the Navy has legitimate standing, and where outcomes, whatever they turn out to be, carry less risk of national embarrassment. For Cuba, the potential cultural and diplomatic implications of confirming a pre-Columbian civilization of extreme antiquity on Cuban territory are significant enough that extreme care in public statements makes political sense, regardless of what the sonar data actually shows. For Japan, the Yonaguni site exists at the intersection of competing scientific communities and a very active dive tourism industry, and the government navigating that carefully is not surprising. What all of this adds up to is a picture that is considerably less dramatic than the headlines suggest. Official bodies are not suppressing evidence of lost civilizations. They are applying the standards that scientific and heritage institutions exist to apply, operating within the budget and jurisdictional constraints that actually govern underwater research, and managing the reputational risks that come with making definitive statements about things that remain genuinely uncertain. 3 sites, 3 sets of unanswered questions, and institutions that, for entirely explicable and largely defensible reasons, are not prepared to say more than the evidence allows. Set all that institutional caution aside for a moment. Forget the budget constraints, the jurisdictional complications, the peer review process. Entertain the hypothesis directly. What if one of these sites, or all 3, turned out to be genuinely man-made? What would that actually mean, and what would it not mean? Because the answer to that question is more interesting and more constrained than either the skeptics or the enthusiasts usually acknowledge. Start with the most tractable case, Yonaguni. The monument sits at roughly 25 metres depth, off the southern tip of Japan's Ryukyu archipelago. Sea level at the last glacial maximum, around 20,000 years ago, was approximately 120 metres lower than it is today. That means the area where the Yonaguni Formation now sits underwater was exposed land during the peak of the last ice age. Sea levels then rose rapidly, on the order of 12 metres per 1,000 years, reaching something close to modern levels by around 7,000 years ago. So if Yonaguni is man-made and was built on dry land, the construction would need to have occurred before the area was submerged, which means before roughly 10,000 to 12,000 years ago at the outside, probably earlier. Masaki Kimura's claim of a 5,000-year-old city runs directly into this problem. At 5,000 years ago, that location was already underwater. A man-made Yonaguni monument would therefore be older than Kimura's own estimate, potentially much older, which would push construction back into a period for which we have virtually no evidence of organised stone architecture anywhere in the world, let alone in the Jomon culture of prehistoric Japan. That is a significant implication. It is not impossible on its face, but it demands evidence commensurate with the claim, and that evidence, datable samples, tool marks, associated artifacts, has not materialized. The Azores structure presents a slightly different set of calculations. With its peak at roughly 40 meters depth and a total height of around 60 meters, the base of the formation would sit at approximately 100 meters below current sea level. For the entire structure to have been above water, sea levels would need to have been at least 100 meters lower than today, which corresponds to conditions that last existed around 20,000 years ago or earlier. A structure built on dry land in the Azores during or before the last glacial maximum would be extraordinarily ancient, predating the Neolithic expansion into the Atlantic islands by thousands of years, predating any documented evidence of human presence in the Azores at all. And that raises a question the enthusiast framing tends to skip over. Who was there? The Azores have no confirmed pre-Portuguese human occupation. If someone built an 8,000 square metre pyramid-shaped structure in the mid-Atlantic before the last glacial maximum, they were doing so at a time and in a place for which we have no archaeological record of any kind. A confirmed man-made structure there would not just challenge existing timelines, it would shatter the foundational assumptions of Atlantic prehistory and demand a complete reconstruction of how and when humans reached and used open ocean island environments. Cuba is where the arithmetic becomes most difficult. The formations identified by the 2001 Project Explorer-Mars sonar survey sit at roughly 650 meters depth. Post-glacial sea level rise, even at its maximum, accounts for only about 120 meters. To explain how a man-made structure ended up 650 meters underwater, you would need either 600 plus meters of tectonic subsidence in the Holocene, which is geologically implausible for the Caribbean basin at the timescales involved, or a construction date so ancient that it predates not just civilization, but behavioral modernity as we currently understand it. The researchers behind the Cuba claim have suggested ages exceeding 50,000 years. 50,000 years ago, Homo sapiens had not yet reached the Americas by any currently documented route. Anatomically, modern humans were only beginning to demonstrate the cognitive and material capabilities associated with complex culture in the archaeological record. A 50,000-year-old pyramid in the Caribbean would not just challenge historical timelines, it would require a fundamental revision of what we believe about human cognitive evolution and migration. That is not an implication that can be waved into existence with sonar images. It requires extraordinary evidence, and the Cuba site has produced none. This is where the distinction between plausible and exaggerated implications becomes critical. If Yonaguni is man-made, the most defensible inference is that late Paleolithic or early Mesolithic people in the Pacific island chain had stoneworking capabilities we did not previously attribute to them, and that coastal settlements in that region were more sophisticated than the surviving record suggests. That would be genuinely significant. It would reshape our understanding of Jomon-era maritime culture and push back the timeline for organized coastal construction in Japan. It would not, however, require a global lost civilization. It would not validate Atlantis. It would not prove that an advanced human society once spanned the oceans and was wiped from the record. It would mean that one group of people in one place built something large out of stone earlier than we thought. Momentous for archaeology, transformative for the regional prehistory of the Pacific, not evidence of a unified ancient global culture. The same principle applies with greater force to the Azores. A confirmed man-made structure, there would be one of the most important archaeological discoveries in human history, genuinely paradigm-shifting for our understanding of Atlantic prehistory, seafaring capability, and the pace of Neolithic expansion. But it would raise specific questions about specific people in a specific region. It would not automatically connect pyramids in Egypt or Mesoamerica or anywhere else. The jump from someone built something unexpected here to therefore a lost civilization connected all ancient cultures is not a logical inference. It is a narrative preference dressed as an implication, and the evidence would need to address each leap independently. What a confirmed underwater pyramid at any of these sites would most credibly imply is something more focused and more interesting than the grand unified theory of a lost civilization, that the pace of coastal settlement, organised construction, and maritime capability in various regions was faster and earlier than the current archaeological record shows. That rising sea levels at the end of the last ice age submerged evidence of complex human activity that we have not yet found because we have not looked in the right places, at depth, along drowned coastlines, in the shallows that were once inhabited land. That is not a fringe idea. Marine archaeologists and geoarchaeologists take it seriously. The hypothesis that significant portions of the prehistoric coastal record are now underwater is well supported by what we know about sea level history, and it is an active area of legitimate research. The problem is that moving from that reasonable hypothesis to confirmation requires the same thing everything else in science requires: physical evidence, rigorous dating, and peer review. None of the three sites has provided that yet. Until one of them does, any statement about what these formations mean for ancient engineering, for maritime history, for the timeline of human civilization remains explicitly hypothetical. The implications, if any of these turned out to be real, would be profound. But profound implications are not a substitute for proof. They are a reason to demand it. So we have established what the evidence actually shows and what it would mean if any of these structures turned out to be genuine. But there is a separate question worth sitting with, one that explains why you're watching a video about underwater pyramids in the first place, and why these three disputed sites have accumulated millions of words of speculation, dozens of documentary appearances, and an almost mythological status in popular culture, despite the fact that not one of them has been confirmed as man-made by a peer-reviewed scientific study. The question is, how does that happen? How does an ambiguous sonar image or a naturally fractured rock formation become, in the public imagination, evidence of a lost civilization? The answer starts with a single moment of genuine uncertainty. A diver sees something geometric. A sonar scan returns an angular shape. A sailor's depth finder registers a rise in the seafloor that looks, on a chart, like a pyramid. That initial moment is real, and the uncertainty is real. Nobody's making anything up at the start. Masaki Kimura genuinely believed he was looking at carved stone at Yonaguni. Diocletian Silva genuinely recorded something significant off the Azores. The Project Exploramar team genuinely captured sonar data off Cuba that showed geometric shapes on the ocean floor. The raw material of the story is authentic. What happens next is where myth-making begins. The first stage is the headline. A discovery that is tentative, disputed, and unverified gets described in terms that are none of those things. Sunken Atlantis pyramid discovered. Ancient underwater city found. Pyramid submerged for 50,000 years. Each of those phrasings carries a weight of certainty that the underlying data simply does not support. But uncertainty is hard to package. Sonar anomaly of ambiguous origin requires further geophysical analysis, does not move clicks. Lost civilization found beneath the waves does. And so the framing shifts before the facts have had a chance to be established, and the shift is not neutral. It shapes every subsequent encounter a reader or viewer has with the story. The second stage is repetition. Once the Yonaguni story appeared in National Geographic in 2007, it became a reference point. Subsequent articles, videos, and documentaries could cite that coverage as a form of institutional legitimacy, even though the National Geographic piece itself was careful to present the debate between Kimura and geologists like Robert Schoch as unresolved. The citation laundered the uncertainty out of the story. By the time a YouTube channel or podcast picks up the Yonaguni narrative in its third or fourth generation of retelling, it is frequently presented not as a debated geological feature, but as the pyramid Japan refuses to officially recognize, which implies there is something to recognize, and that the refusal is suspect rather than simply the result of insufficient evidence. The same pattern followed the Azores discovery. The Archaeology News Network reported it in 2021 with appropriate caveats about ongoing Portuguese Navy investigation and undetermined origin. That careful framing rarely survived the journey into viral social media posts and speculative video essays, which tended to lead with the pyramid and bury the uncertainty if they mentioned it at all. The third stage is the cultural template. Underwater ruins do not arrive in a neutral imaginative space. They arrive in a space already furnished with Atlantis, with Mu, with every sunken civilization story that has accumulated in Western and global storytelling for centuries. Plato's Atlantis was a philosophical device, not a geographical report, but it has functioned for 2,000 years as a kind of permission slip for the idea that an advanced civilization once existed and was lost. When a sonar image off Cuba shows geometric shapes, that image does not just look like rock formations to a culturally primed audience. It looks like confirmation of something people already wanted to believe. The framing does not create the desire, it finds it and feeds it. Labeling the Cuba site as potential evidence of a civilization older than 50,000 years, or connecting the Azores pyramid to pre-Columbian Atlantic crossings, or describing Yonaguni as a city older than Egypt, these rhetorical moves are effective precisely because the audience has been culturally prepared to receive them. The fourth stage is the reinterpretation of silence. When the Japanese Cultural Agency declines to designate Yonaguni as cultural heritage, that institutional non-recognition is read by myth-reinforcing narratives not as a reasonable response to inconclusive evidence, but as suppression. When the Portuguese Navy says its investigation is ongoing and has not yet determined the origin of the Azores formation, that honest scientific caution is reframed as delay or obfuscation. When Cuban authorities provide only sonar data and no follow-up expedition results, that becomes evidence of a cover-up rather than a reflection of limited research funding and logistical complexity. Institutional silence, which is often simply the absence of definitive results, gets absorbed into the narrative as confirmation that something significant is being hidden. And once that frame is in place, it is nearly impossible to dislodge, because any absence of evidence becomes evidence of absence being concealed. This is the full myth-making cycle, and it is worth naming clearly because understanding it is protective. An ambiguous discovery is announced in sensational terms. Repetition across platforms builds an aura of legitimacy that is independent of any actual verification. A pre-existing cultural template absorbs the story and connects it to a larger narrative of lost civilization. Institutional caution is reframed as suppression, and by the time a viewer encounters the story, in a documentary, a podcast, a YouTube video, or this one, the claim feels established even though the underlying evidence has not changed since the original, cautious, unverified announcement. The way to interrupt that cycle is not to stop being curious. Curiosity about these sites is entirely reasonable. The possibility that drowned coastlines conceal evidence of earlier human habitation and activity is scientifically legitimate, and the 3 sites we have examined in this video represent genuine open questions. The interruption comes from asking 3 specific things whenever you encounter a claim like these. First, who made this claim and what is their method? A marine geologist, a peer-reviewed geophysicist, and a dive enthusiast with a YouTube channel are not equivalent sources, even if they all use similar language. Second, what was actually measured, and by what instrument? Sonar anomalies, photographic impressions, and eyewitness descriptions from dives are not the same as stratigraphic dating, tool mark analysis, or independent geological survey. Third, what has been independently verified? A claim that has been repeated across 50 websites is not a claim that has been confirmed. Independent verification means a separate team, using separate methods, reaching the same conclusion. For none of the 3 sites we have examined, Yonaguni, the Azores, or Cuba, has that independent verification occurred? None of that means the wonder has to leave the room. The possibility that human beings built something at these locations thousands of years before the historical record begins, before the seas swallowed the coastlines they lived on, is genuinely extraordinary to contemplate. The prospect that our map of prehistoric human capability is incomplete, that the drowned margins of the continents might hold evidence we have not yet found, is not fringe speculation. It is a reasonable scientific hypothesis that marine archaeologists take seriously. The wonder is real. What myth-making does is not amplify that wonder. It actually diminishes it by substituting a satisfying story for a genuine investigation. The real discovery, if it ever comes, will be more surprising and more specific than any Atlantis narrative could accommodate. It will emerge not from repetition and sensational framing, but from the slow, expensive, unglamorous work of measurement, verification, and peer review. That process is less dramatic. It is also the only one that produces something true. So after everything, the sonar images, the dives, the competing geologists, the Navy surveys, the headlines, and the myth-making cycle, let's bring it back to solid ground, or as close to solid ground as the evidence allows, because there is something genuinely satisfying about laying out exactly what we know, what we don't, and what it would take to close the gap. At Yonaguni, the confirmed facts are these. There is a submerged rock formation off the southern tip of Japan, rising from roughly 25 meters of depth and spanning approximately 300 meters by 150 meters on the seafloor. It has stepped, angular features. Divers have been exploring it since the mid-1980s. Marine geologist Masaki Kimura spent years cataloguing what he described as quarry marks, carved channels, and deliberate stonework, and he argued the site represents the remains of a city approximately 5,000 years old. That argument was taken seriously enough to generate real scientific debate. On the other side, geologists, including Robert Schoch, examined the same formations and concluded they are consistent with natural sandstone fracturing driven by tectonic stress, the kind of right-angle breaks and layered terracing that sandstone produces on its own, without any human assistance. Japan's Agency for Cultural Affairs and Okinawa Prefecture have not designated the site as cultural heritage. No peer-reviewed study has produced radiocarbon dates, thermoluminescence readings, or any absolute chronology for the site. The biggest unresolved question at Yonaguni is the one it started with. Is this natural, or was any part of it shaped by human hands? That question remains genuinely open. Not open in the way that myth-making narratives suggest, as though the answer is obvious and being suppressed. Open in the scientific sense, meaning the available evidence is insufficient to decide. At the Azores, the confirmed facts are fewer, because the discovery is more recent. In 2021, an amateur sailor named Diocletian Silva recorded an anomaly in the seafloor between the islands of Terceira and São Miguel. Subsequent measurements suggested a structure approximately 60 meters tall with a roughly square base of around 8,000 square meters, aligned to the cardinal points. The Portuguese Navy's Hydrographic Institute acknowledged the finding and initiated sonar and geophysical surveys to determine its origin. That investigation was ongoing as of the most recent reporting. The Atlantic seabed in that region has been submerged for roughly 20,000 years. No archaeological material, no ceramics, no tool marks, no organic remains has been recovered from the site. The cardinal alignment generated significant excitement, since aligned structures are often associated with intentional construction. But naturally formed volcanic features in the Azores region can also produce regular geometry, and the site sits in one of the most volcanically active zones in the Atlantic. The biggest unresolved question at the Azores is whether this is a volcanic formation, a naturally eroded seamount, or something that was modified or built. Nobody has answered that yet. The investigation is real, which is worth saying plainly. There is an actual scientific body doing actual survey work. The results simply have not arrived. Off Cuba, the confirmed facts are the most limited of the three. In 2001, the Project Explorer team, led by researchers Paulina Zalitsky and Paul Weinsweig, captured sonar images of geometric stone shapes covering roughly 2 square kilometers at a depth of approximately 650 meters off the Guanahaca-Bibs Peninsula. The shapes included what appeared to be pyramid-like forms. The researchers suggested the structures could be more than 50,000 years old. Those figures, the depth, the area, the general geometry, come from the original sonar data and represent what was actually measured. Everything beyond that is inference. No physical samples have been retrieved from the site. No follow-up expedition results have been published in peer-reviewed literature. No independent team has conducted its own survey and reached independent conclusions. The depth alone makes the Cuba site extraordinarily difficult to investigate, and the absence of follow-up work is more likely a reflection of logistical and financial constraints than any deliberate concealment. The biggest unresolved question at Cuba is whether the shapes in those sonar images are geological in origin or anthropogenic. And right now, there is genuinely no way to answer that without equipment, funding, and access that have not yet been brought to bear. Here is what all three sites share. None of them has published, peer-reviewed, absolute dating of any material. None of them has achieved scientific consensus on whether the structures are natural or man-made. None of the official or governmental bodies with jurisdiction over these locations has accepted them as proven examples of ancient human construction. The mystery at each site is real, but it is real because the evidence is incomplete, not because a lost civilization has been found and is waiting for acknowledgement. That distinction matters more than it might seem. Incomplete evidence is an invitation to investigate. It is not confirmation of anything, and the standard for what future evidence would need to show is actually quite clear. Any one of these sites could move from disputed anomaly to genuine discovery if a research team recovers datable organic or worked material from the site, conducts rigorous stratigraphic analysis of the surrounding geology, documents tool marks or construction techniques that cannot be explained by natural fracturing, and publishes those findings in a peer-reviewed journal where independent researchers can scrutinize and replicate the conclusions. That process is demanding. It is also the only process that produces knowledge rather than speculation. The underwater world still holds more than we have mapped. Drowned coastlines cover land that was inhabited by human beings during the last ice age, and marine archaeology is a young enough discipline that significant discoveries almost certainly remain ahead. The possibility that something real is waiting at Yonaguni, or in the Azores, or off the coast of Cuba, is not absurd. It is simply unconfirmed. And unconfirmed, approached honestly, is not a dead end. It is exactly where science begins.